Welcome to Finding Hope, the End to Suffering. Hosted by psychologist, author, and co-founder of the Colorado Institute for Conflict Resolution and Creative Leadership, Dr. Barry Weinhold, with national radio host, award-winning producer, and inspirational speaker, Patricia Raskin.
Hi, Patricia. I'm Barry Weinhold, and my co-host, Patricia Raskin.
Hi, Barry, for this wonderful program, Finding Hope.
Enjoy getting together with you and helping to inspire other people that they can find hope in their lives. And sometimes in these days, it's hard to do that. This is dark times in many ways for many people. The COVID crisis, the quarantining, the loss of jobs, loss of sometimes in loss of residences for people, or at least a threat of being evicted. It's a very dark time for people, and so I'm glad we have this show to give people a chance to see that this too shall pass, and that there's ways that you can work through this dark time and find hope and end any suffering that you're having as a result of it.
Yes, and I'd like to add to that, Barry. I think that you select people who have really been through some amazingly difficult times. I mean, and when you look at these things that they've been through at face value, when you read them, you say, how does anybody get through all of that?
I know.
And these people that we've interviewed have not only survived, but they've thrived. And I think that's the hope and the inspiration that I know that you want to leave the listener. I mean, you've written 76 books on this. You're a PhD, you're a teacher, a professor, an expert in this field. And it was really your brainchild that said, we want to help these people who have lost hope to find hope. And so this is what the program really does. And this is a tough time, particularly with the variant, the COVID variant. So this is a great time to be doing this.
And incidentally, I'm just watching TV. I don't know what that is. I've been watching TV, and the word hope comes up time after time, every day. I see that word appearing. So it's out there as a reminder that, and I think the news media is conscious of the fact that people need hope at this time. So anyway, I just want to say one word about helping us as we're helping you. And we do need donations, tax-deductible donations to our institute. And Ben, there is he put up the link that takes you directly to the donation page on our website, and any donation that you give of any value, any number, is tax deductible, and you will get a receipt that you can use when you do your taxes for next year. So that gives you a chance to give us some support so we can sustain this, because it is costly to put these programs on every month, and so we appreciate any donations you can give. So I would like to start today, Patricia, by just giving a little bit of background and history about prisons.
And let's talk about who we're bringing on.
Let's do that first.
I mean, we have this amazing guest coming on very soon, and her name is Dr. Karen Gedney, and she is an internal medicine specialist who was in 1987 the first woman doctor placed in a male medium security prison in Nevada. And against all odds, she stayed 3 decades and turned this into her calling. And she's recognized both in the medical and professional fields. And we'll talk more about her and awards she's won. But this is really the reason, I think, Barry, that you want to focus on what's going on in prisons.
But she also wrote a book about her experience, a memoir, and we'd like to show a cover of that and a picture of Karen, and then we can talk a little bit further about mental health reform in prisons. So Ben, if you could put up the cover of the book, and
it's called 30 Years Behind Bars. 30 Years Behind Bars, Trials of a Prison Doctor, Karen Gedney Md. Okay, great. Thank you. All right, so Barry, your thoughts about this?
I was about to sneeze here in just a minute.
Okay.
All right. So anyway, the the Department of Defense wanted to know whether who would be most likely to have PTSD after being in combat. And so they thought that people who grew up in a war zone in a city would be resilient. You know, they would have had trauma in their background, in their childhood, and growing in their neighborhood and their community, and that they would do fine in combat and wouldn't have as much possibility of PTSD. And then they thought, well, rural people who grew up on a farm, they have probably a stable family, a rural community without much violence, and they thought those people might have trouble in combat. And it turned out to be the opposite. That people who grew up in a war zone, so to speak, in a family, had much more of a possibility of a post-traumatic stress disorder than those who grew up on a farm. So they kind of rethought their whole idea about who would make a good soldier. And apparently what they found was that basically people who have had previous trauma, when they experience new trauma, it just builds on what they already have. And so they realized that people with previous trauma will not do as well in combat and will have PTSD. And that was the findings of that study. There's been a long-term research study that, and actually in looking at prisons, I'll move it up just a bit, Ben, to the title on the screen. There you are. There's been some research on the need for mental health reform in prisons. You know, we currently have 2.3 million people in our prisons, and we're first in the world in terms of prison population. And so there's something called the ACE research. It's called the Adverse Childhood Experience Research, and it's an epidemiological study sponsored by the Centers for Disease Control and Kaiser Permanente Health System. And they started this long-term study, but they also interviewed and gave a questionnaire to, at first it was about 17,000, and then they did another 30,000, and now it's over hundreds of thousands of people have taken this questionnaire, and they've analyzed the data, and they looked at the long-term effects of trauma, of childhood trauma on their lives, including their physical and mental health problems and their lifestyle problems. So, and they found tremendous correlations between like a person who had 4 or more incidents of childhood trauma had a double the chance of becoming an alcoholic, double the chance of having cancer, having heart disease. I mean, all kinds of mental and physical ailments. So they did a study also comparing the general population with the prison population. And they found out that in the prison population, in the general population, about 66% of the men had at least one plus of the adverse childhood experiences in their background. But 97% of the male prisoners had at least one. So almost everybody had at least one adverse childhood experience that might be still having long-term effects on their lives. Then they found that they compared people with 4 or more adverse childhood experience. And these people were found to be 7 times more likely to be in prison. People who had 4 or more of these adverse childhood experiences. So it's clear that childhood trauma has carried people into their adulthood and is often part of why they end up in prison. 70% of these people came from a broken home, these men in prison. 63 suffered from emotional stress, 63%. 60% suffered physical abuse. 49% actually suffered sexual abuse as a child. 61% suffered physical neglect. And then 63% witnessed substance abuse in their family. So, I mean, this research nails the problem. We don't have the solution for it, but it definitely calls for the need for more research in the area of mental health reform in prison.
And I think that Dr. Gedney will talk about that as well today.
Yes.
in terms of what she's seen and what she thinks
Right.
works.
I think we can add a lot of content from her experience to that research to show that this is a big problem in prisons today. And then I also looked at, well, what are the common reactions people have to trauma? And so I have a list of those, Ben, if you want to put that up, and I'll talk a little bit about that for a minute. And that's that these are the most common reactions that people have to traumatic events that happen. Not necessarily childhood events, but it could be that they lost their home in a flood, or there's a hurricane, or some kind of tornado, or a fire, as we had one of our previous guests talk about, and
Or someone dying from COVID in their family.
somebody dying of COVID in their family. Absolutely. And so these are the kind of things that kind of linger with people after they've experienced a traumatic event in their life. They have trouble sleeping. Obviously, that's a difficult one, because at night sometimes mind wanders and people wander back to thinking about the trauma. Hypervigilance is another one, which means that they are constantly on guard, watching for something bad to happen. And this actually, people who have chronic hypervigilance actually exhaust their adrenal stress, their adrenal system, basically, adrenal hormones. And because they have an adrenal stress response, which is either to fight, flight, or freeze when they perceive something in their environment as dangerous. But if they're hypervigilant, they're looking everywhere for something just to make sure there's nothing out there. And they're easily startled. They have a short fuse, so to speak, and anything that happens quickly or out of their unexpectedly out of their awareness can startle them. And they're easily distracted. It's hard for them to concentrate. They also have fears and anxiety. They worry about the future. They also have anger. And oftentimes that's a hard one for people to access, but it's important to do that. It's important to understand that, they have a right to be angry about what happened. And they have deep sadness because often they lost something. And if it was a flood or a hurricane or a tornado, they might have lost their house.
And Barry, can that be translated into just negativity? They always look for the thing that's wrong,
Right.
What's going wrong in the world and how this didn't happen, or whether it's a political wrong or it's environmental wrong or it's a historical wrong. They go to that first.
And then some people have guilt, and they blame themselves because they rethink the whole scene that happened, and they think, boy, if I'd have done this, maybe I could have prevented it. Well, usually that's not true. But in case of natural disasters, it's not true. But sometimes it's in any other kind of event trauma, that can be something that lasts a long time for people. And then they avoid anything that reminds them of the event. So, and depending on whatever the event entailed, they try to avoid anything that would remind them of that. And then obviously that leads them to have trouble trusting people, particularly if they feel let down by some loved one or something in their traumatic event. And then they kind of go to replaying the event in their mind, going over it and over it and over it, trying to figure out why this happened to me and what do I do about it. And then the last one, they often end up defining themselves as weak or inadequate because this happened to them. And none of those are really, in the long run, going to get you through it, but they're part of what happens. And these are often initial reactions, although they can last for a long time with some people. But that's what I call unnecessary suffering. And there's obviously suffering when you have a natural disaster or you have some event that's traumatic. But there's a point where it is unnecessary to continue suffering around that. And we encourage anyone who's been in any kind of traumatic event to seek therapy, to get some help, get an outside person to help you through any of these reactions so that they don't persist and you don't have to suffer.
Right. And Barry, too, bringing up the point that it's not like they're bad people or there's something wrong with them. This is a natural reaction.
These are all natural reactions.
It's been buried, right? They haven't addressed it.
Right.
Maybe.
And to me, trauma is not something bad. It's just something happened to us, and we have to find a way to get through that and
Yeah.
actually come out stronger and more resilient.
Yeah, yeah. And this might be a really good time, if you think, to bring on Dr. Gedney.
Yeah, I would. Thank you.
Really talk about, how she sees this in terms of trauma. And it's a sneak preview for the 3 other programs that we'll have for the rest of the month
Right.
with Dr. Gedney, where she'll talk about what she went through, 30 years behind bars, the trials of prison doctor, which is in her book.
So welcome, Karen.
Dr.
And,
Gedney.
Well,
Welcome,
thank
Karen.
you.
and I'm eager to see if you heard us and we introduced you. If you want to add anything, this would be a time you can add anything to.
Well, let me just read her bio again.
Okay.
Now that we've brought you on, Karen, and we'll do this each time that you come on the program. But Karen Gedney, MD, is an internal medicine specialist who in 1987 was the first woman doctor placed in a male medium security prison in Nevada. Against all odds, she stayed 3 decades and turned this into her calling. Dr. Gedney is recognized in both the medical and the correctional fields. She was she won an award as Heroes for the Humanity Award in Nevada and was noted one of the best in the business by the American Correctional Association. When she retired from the prison system, she became an activist in the prison reform movement and wrote her memoir, 30 Years Behind Bars, The Trial of a Prison Doctor. Today, she advocates for prison reform and inspires individuals and groups to become involved in reforming the prison system. Welcome, Dr. Gedney.
Yeah.
Thank you, Patricia.
Anything to add?
Well, what I wanted to add, you were both talking about the ACE study, the Adverse Childhood Experience Study, which I'm very familiar with. And I think for me, when I was placed in the prison, and I was placed by the government in the prison because the prison was under lawsuits and they had to get a doctor. And when I entered, I had, let's just say I was about as naive as they come because I really didn't understand how a prison operated or really my role in that type of world. What I found, though, was that the outside world looks at people in prisons as they're bad people. And when I came in, I somehow lacked that judgment piece in my brain. I think it's because I was raised without religion, about judging good and evil. I had this mindset of always curious, why do people do what they do? And I think that's very much what enabled me to stay all those years in prison, because I wanted to know, well, how did you exactly become a pedophile or a rapist or an arsonist or a serial killer?
Mhm.
Or how did you exactly become a heroin addict? I had this curiosity because to me in the medical field, if you don't understand the root cause of
Mhm.
the symptom, you're not going anywhere. And I was working in an environment which was oriented to shame and punish and didn't care about the front-loaded questions that I had. That put us at a bit of odds between the way I looked at it and the way custody and administration and the prison world looked at
Mhm.
the men.
Very good. Yeah, I think that I mean, obviously, that wasn't easy to do. Doing the job you were doing, and also observing everybody and trying to find out what the cause was of why they were put in prison in the first place.
Right. Yeah. And it was mostly, I also realized just from basic psychological studies that you don't change behavior by shaming someone or punishing
No,
someone, because it drives whatever the problem is even worse down into the psyche. And that just didn't make sense to me watching how the prison operated.
well,
Right,
this
and that's what we're going to talk about in this entire series that we have for the next 3 weeks. So Barry, anything to add before we close and then reintroduce this next week?
No, I think we've introduced the topic, we've introduced Karen, and we're eager to next week jump into the meat of the interview with her and have her tell us her story.
Absolutely.
And what she learned from having 30 years in prison.
Mm-hmm. And your website for the book, Karen, I know we can put it up on the screen, but what is it?
It's discoverdrg.com.
Okay, discoverdrg.com.
That's it.
You have it up on the screen.
Yeah.
Perfect. All right.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we're going to come back next week and for the next 3 weeks, and we're going to talk to Dr. Karen Gedney, who is the author of the new book, 30 Years Behind Bars, Trials of a Prison Doctor, and how she stayed with it and still believed in the system and how she's helping to reform it. And it's an amazing story of Barry's title of the show, Finding Hope, right? Finding hope and how we can, again, get through suffering. All right. So we're going to say bye for this week, and we'll be back next week. I'm Patricia Raskin.
I'm Barry Weinhold.
This episode was brought to you by the Colorado Institute for Conflict Resolution and Creative Leadership. Find out more about these resources at weinholds.org. Dr. Weinhold is the author or co-author of 75 books on psychology, including his latest book, Get Real, The Hazards of Living Out of Your False Self, available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and more. Patricia Raskin is the host of the nationally recognized program, The Patricia Raskin Positive Living Show, and is currently heard on voiceamerica.com, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and more. New episodes of Finding Hope, The End to Suffering can be found every Wednesday. If you like the show, please leave a review and give us a rating.